Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the July 2023 Council Agenda Briefing. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners and custodians of this land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and their elders past and present. I would like to advise everyone that the audio of this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. I request everyone to please turn off your mobile phones. I remind you that audio recording of the meeting proceedings and photography within the chamber is prohibited unless prior approval has been granted, and councillors and city officers are reminded to disclose any declarations of financial interests and interests affecting impartiality and are requested to activate their microphones when addressing the meeting. So, with that, welcome. Item 1 is the declaration of opening, and I declare this meeting open at 1 minute past 6 p.m. Items for Council. Agenda items 2, 3, 6, 7, 8.1, 8.2, 9, 11, 13 and 14 will be dealt with at the ordinary council meeting to be held on 25 July 2023. That brings us to item 4, which is attendance. Item 4.1 is apologies, of which there's nil this evening, and item 4.2 is approved leaves of absence, of which there is nil this evening. Item 5 is declarations of interest. We've got a few this evening, so bear with me. Councillor Nick Warland has declared an impartiality interest in item 10.3.2 as an individual and companies named in the information before council are known to me. Councillor Nick Warland has declared an impartiality interest in item 10.3.3 as revocation of some local planning policies listed in this report relate to completed projects undertaken by clients of a former employer who are clients for the duration of my employment. Mayor Greg Milner, that's me, have declared an impartiality interest in item 12.1 as I'm a former co-patron of the Wesleyan South Perth Wasp Hockey Club. Councillor Nick Warland has declared an impartiality interest in item 12.1 as senior representatives of Wasps management are known to me through previous professional relationships. Councillor Stephen Russell has declared an impartiality interest in item 12.1 as a family member has, is and may in the future be a member of the Wasps Hockey Club. As a consequence, there may be a perception that my impartiality on the matter may be affected. I declare that I will consider this matter on its merits and vote accordingly. Mayor Greg Milner, that's me. I've declared a financial and proximity interest in item 12.2 as this item may result in financial gain, loss, benefit or detriment to persons who donated to my election campaign in 2019. This item also concerns a proposed change to the use of land that adjoins land owned by those same persons. Councillor Nick Warland has declared a financial and proximity interest in item 12.2 as donors to my campaign at the 2023 Como Ward extraordinary election own or enjoy right of use to property impacted by any council decision on this item. And CEO Mike Bradford has declared a financial interest in item 15.1.1 as the report relates to my contract of employment. Councillors, does anyone else have any other interests that they wish to declare this evening? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did send a disclosure through to the CEO and yourself prior to this meeting, but maybe you haven't received that yet. But just in relation to item 12.1, for the engagement with the Wesley South Perth Hockey Club to identify an alternate location within the City of South Perth for co-located hockey facilities, an impartiality interest, as my husband has been a past member of Wasps Hockey Club and a volunteer coach and is also a Wesley College Old Boy, and my sons have played for Wasps and they also attend Wesley College. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Choi. Councillors, any other items or interests? Councillor Credland.
My disclosure of interest is in respect of the same item as Councillor Choi, and my interest is in the past my children did play hockey for the Wasps Hockey Club.
And I assume that's an impartiality interest, Councillor Cridland?
It is.
Thank you. Councillors, any other declarations of interest to be made this evening? That's a no. Okay. That brings us to item 8, which is presentations. Item 8.3 is deputations. And this evening we have 2 speakers who will have up to 10 minutes in total to address council. To begin with, I'd like to welcome Kathy Lees of South Perth, who is speaking for the notice of motion on item 12.2. Welcome, Ms. Lees. The microphone is yours.
Okay. Do I need, whoops, move over here? That's better? Sorry. Whoops. Okay, that'll do. Good evening, Mayor, councillors and city officers. I'm the President of South Perth Tree Canopy Advocates and the Secretary of the WA Tree Canopy Advocates, and I'd like to speak in favour of item 12.2, the notice of motion by Councillor Stephen Russell for the inclusion of the South Perth Esplanade foreshore into the Urban Forest Strategy Review. I'm very pleased to hear that the Urban Forest Strategy Review is being commenced this year. It is a critical piece of work to influence the future livability of our suburbs, given the ever-increasing pressures on our natural environment, not the least of which being climate change and increasing temperatures around the globe and especially in cities. So, what do we know? We know that optimal tree canopy cover to provide the cooling, shade and other critical environmental benefits of trees in urban areas is widely accepted around the world as 30%. And we know that in 2020, canopy cover across the city of South Perth was 17%, and 3 years later, it is now likely considerably lower. Looking at the first slide, in 2020, canopy cover in the suburb of South Perth in particular was also 17%. And again, it's likely significantly lower now, but it's also worth noting that while 28% of land in the suburb, as shown on the slide, is parkland, this parkland only contributed 7% of the suburb's 17% canopy cover. So the message there is that there is huge room for improvement. So the South Perth Esplanade foreshore is arguably the most barren piece of parkland in the city of South Perth and around Perth Water. It is predominantly grassed with a few rose bushes and the odd palm tree. This would appear to be as a consequence of the influence of a vocal minority who live in adjacent residential developments and have opposed any planting that will obstruct their views. Sorry, gone too far. There we go. In 2020, the South Perth Esplanade foreshore had 0 to 5% canopy cover west of the Men's Street jetty and only 5 to 10% to the east, with most of this actually being at Mindeer up in front of the jetty. So when you compare that to areas like the golf course, which is sitting at 30 to 40%, Richardson Park, which is 15 to 20%, given it is parkland, it is really significantly underperforming. So while this lack of canopy, so while this lack of canopy allows unimpeded views from adjoining residences, not surprisingly, given the lack of trees and the shade and cooling they provide, it is not an area that is comfortable for the wider community to linger in and enjoy on a sunny day. The heat mapping shows that on a day in the late 30s, the temperature on the grassed area was between 40 and 50 degrees. compared to low 30s in other shaded tree areas on the foreshore. The Swan and Canning River foreshores, including the South Perth Esplanade foreshore, are set aside under the Metropolitan Region scheme as regional parks and recreation reserves for the benefit of the South Perth community, the wider Perth community and the WA community. As part of the review of the urban forest strategy, now is the obvious time for some meaningful community engagement that considers the needs and views of all of the foreshore stakeholders and looks to provide a fairer, more equitable outcome. We know that our foreshore and natural spaces are highly valued by all South Perth residents and that there is a growing proportion of our community who are very concerned about our declining tree canopy. Jeff Baker, member for South Perth, recently asked in his newsletter whether we need more trees along the foreshore, focusing on the Esplanade as the issue. And he has since told us that he had an enthusiastic response from all over South Perth about the shade and amenity on the foreshore. A lot of people think that something should be done, were his words. So, where should the city's efforts to expand our urban forest be focused? Yes, we need to get new trees in the ground quickly and we need to increase canopy cover broadly across the city of South Perth. But we also need to make sure that we plant them where they will have maximum benefit for the community. That is, firstly, in and around where people live and where people recreate. Secondly, in hotspot areas where canopy is lacking most. And two, where trees will best support our wildlife and enhance biodiversity. The South Perth Esplanade foreshore ticks all of these boxes. A good design could surely allow for views between trees and areas of undergrowth and make it a great place for everyone to enjoy rather than just the fortunate minority who can afford to live along the foreshore. Good design would not result in a wall of trees, but allow views of the city that incorporate trees. Perhaps it would even enhance the views from the adjacent homes. Notwithstanding this, it is worth noting that under the WA planning framework, nobody owns a view. Wouldn't it be amazing to see this part of the foreshore contribute to a strong biodiversity link from Kings Park along our foreshore to parklands further to the east and south, with trees that provide shade to enhance the public's enjoyment of the spaces, as well as supporting and showcasing our iconic flora and fauna. A good design would also enhance visitation to the area, in turn supporting local businesses. Quality community engagement that listens to all stakeholders will encourage community buy-in and ownership. This, together with new technologies, can hopefully avoid past issues with vandalism. So in closing off, no, we don't want to see the progress of the Urban Forest Strategy review delayed. The progress of the strategy must not be dependent upon agreement on the approach to the South Perth Esplanade, but the strategy must not ignore this valuable area that is so desperately in need of attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lees. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Lees this evening? That's a no. Oh, Councillor Quitland.
Ms Lees, I just missed a part of your presentation at the end where you said something or other, and that might lead to a reduction in the possibility of vandalism. I presume you were referring to that terrible time that we had the 20-metre plane tree chopped down at the end of Menn Street as an example of a tree being chopped down. But I didn't hear what you said was the reason why we might anticipate there won't be vandalism by people.
Well, I think that's always an issue, but and I think there's been numerous cases in the past where the city's planted along the foreshore and trees have been removed overnight, miraculously disappeared. What I'm suggesting is that with proper community engagement, hopefully you get better buy-in from the community and a sense of ownership, and you can get some more balanced approach that achieves better outcomes for everybody. So maintains views and addresses the shade issue and the biodiversity issue. But also I think there's advances in technology such as CCTV that could help in identifying the people involved. There's also other measures that other councils use when trees are removed to highlight that fact and try and avoid it in the future. So there's options there that could be considered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? No. Thank you for your deputation, Ms Lees. I'd now like to invite Mr Peter Carter of South Perth, who is speaking against the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.2. Welcome, Mr Carter, and Mr Dempsey. The microphone is yours.
Mr Mayor, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. I was down to deputise to speak, but I get awfully emotional and quite passionate about South Perth Esplanade, the peninsula, you know, and South Perth generally. I love the area. I'm a member of sporting clubs. I live there, and I've got a lot of clients who have bought into the area, including in high rise and all over the South Perth. And like I say, the reason I'm, you know, I think one of the main reasons that stretch of grass is so iconic is because we get tourists from all over the world that come down there and take a panoramic vista across the river. There's picnics, and for the sake of, you know, like we met with our local MLA, and he gave us the same argument, you know, like in the middle of summer when I go for a walk, and I said, why do you walk in the middle of the day? You know, like sure it's hot, you know, the same reason you don't go to the beach in the middle of the day. You know, like there's other parts of the park which are there, which already provide shade and that. So there's a little bit of the river for everybody. So if somebody wants to have a nice picnic or whatever, now 90% of the use of the Foreshore Reserve in the summertime is in the evening or dusk. You know, and you get all the families come down. They sit on the park under the lights and looking at the lights, and it's you know, there's thousands of people use the foreshore. And 90% of the year, and I'm talking about winter time, you don't see people down there sitting under trees and, you know, like they're sitting out in the sun now. You know, they're walking the foreshore. They're not necessarily, and they're not, and somebody silly enough to go for a walk in 42 degrees without a hat on, you know, like the same reason I don't go to the beach when it's that hot, you know, or go and play golf. You know, anyway, like I say, I get too emotional about it. So I'm handing over to Pete to sort of give you his presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you, Mayor, and thank you, councillors. We are not against trees. In fact, we love trees. But there are certain places they are not suitable, which is why we, along with many in our local community, are totally opposed to this proposal. The issue of planting trees on the foreshore along the South Perth Esplanade is an issue that's been raised at councils a number of times before and has never gained the support of the vast majority of the community. At one of those deputations, a petition of over 700 people objected to it. That community sentiment has not changed. Indeed, if it were not for the motion only becoming known last Friday, there would have been many, many more deputations speaking against this motion tonight. Let me outline why this motion should be rejected. The motion refers in the main to the urban forest strategy from the 1960s. That's a strategy that's over 60 years old. That strategy was never adopted to any great extent at that time or since, so it makes no sense to refer to it now. Number two, to the contrary, and much more relevant to these days and to this proposal, in more recent years, the South Perth Council officers have conducted a series of extensive investigations and reports into the South Perth foreshore, and in particular, the section adjacent to the South Perth Esplanade. All were extensive in the community consultation, research and planning and cost. Those plans are much more relevant and current than the 60-plus-year-old urban forestry plan. Those plans have also resulted in a number of strategy and planning initiatives along the South Perth Esplanade foreshore that involved adding of the adding to the greenery and amenity, including shade cover, native and trees. From the motion, point 3, from the motion, one would get the impression that the South Perth Esplanade part of the foreshore was just one stretch of grass without any greenery or amenity, and none has ever been added, particularly in more recent times. Nothing could be further from the truth. Along that stretch of the foreshore, there are 3 rose gardens, 2 significant green nodes incorporating a considerable number of native shrubs and other plantings, 6 significant and fully grown palm trees and a fully grown gum tree, all at the eastern end of the esplanade, numerous significant fully grown trees around the Main Street jetty precedent, numerous seating options, including some covered with umbrellas, and in more recent times, 24 large trees were planted on the foreshore as part of the Main Street Connect project, each of which will grow to 8 metres tall and add significant shade. And there has just been a significant planting of low-lying shrubs, natives and greenery as part of the recent upgrade of the footpath at the western end of the South Perth Esplanade. Point 4. In Councillor Russell's submission, he refers to the council being water-wise. While the point Councillor Russell is trying to make is unclear to me, if he's alluding to lawn using water, then the addition of trees will not alleviate that. In fact, it will make it worse, as the lawn will still exist under the tree and the tree needs watering too. Point 5. Councillor Russell asserts that during hotter periods of the year, the South Perth foreshore is not used by the public to its full extent. Firstly, during hot days, the areas of the foreshore that have shade are also not fully utilised, as people generally do not go to the foreshore or parks on hot days. They go to places like the beach or places that are air-conditioned. Planting trees will not change that. As an aside, people don't fully utilise the foreshore when it rains either, and trees won't change that either. Secondly, one gets the impression that when people go to the foreshore, they are all seeking shade. To the contrary, having lived on the Esplanade for over 25 years, the majority of people I observe sit in the sun to enjoy the sun. However, as pointed out earlier, there is already both adequate shade and tree cover all along the South Perth Esplanade section of the foreshore for those that desire it. It does not need to be added to. Additionally, all the way from the Narrows Bridge to the Causeway, there are thousands and thousands of trees, native shrubs and greenery. Point 6. The long, spacious lawns along the South Perth Esplanade provide a spectacular and unparalleled panoramic view to the city. Those views are a totally unique attraction to Perth, world-renowned, and one of the most iconic and panoramic views in Western Australia. Indeed, they have become part of the identity of South Perth itself, such that they are now one of South Perth's main assets. That panoramic view draws its beauty from its simplicity. The planting of more trees will destroy that asset and simplicity. As councillors that represent the ratepayers of South Perth, you are the custodians and guardians of that asset and are duly bound to protect it. To conclude, to commission another report of a similar nature to what has been done in the recent past and involve the council's officers in time and expense when the council has already undertaken and implemented their own extensive plans and works on the South Perth Esplanade in recent times, which includes the planting of trees, seems an extraordinary waste of the council officers' time and the ratepayers' money given the submission I've just made. Rejecting this motion outright is not a vote against trees or those that advocate for them. Indeed, in my observation, South Perth is one of the more greener suburbs in the state. It's just common sense. I thank you for the opportunity to speak on the motion.
Thank you for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Mr Carter or Mr Dempsey? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you for your deputation. Forgive me if I'm mistaken here, but are you making the argument that there should be no additional trees along the foreshore adjacent to the esplanade?
What I'm saying, or what we are saying, is that there is a satisfactory number of trees on the South Perth Esplanade. Yes, there are trees there. There are quite a few trees there, and we are definitely making that argument. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to refer you to point 3C of the notice of motion, which says enable the future reduction in turf areas whilst maintaining the objectives of the South Perth foreshore strategy. Now, that strategy talks about allowing for vistas for both the reserve users and for adjacent property owners. So what do you say with regard to the notice of motion whilst understanding that?
Well, my understanding, and I've lived in the area for over 25 years, is there's been numerous reports and strategies put in place. The last I can recall went for some period of time. It had 9 nodes. It's been implemented. There's the most recent one, which was the Connect, which planted 24 large trees. So to my way of thinking, the council officers have implemented the plans that have already been researched. They were consulted with community. They've been through that process. They've been through it probably in the last 15 years 2 or 3 times. And each time there's been a result. Those results have been implemented. I don't see why the council and the council office have to go through it again when it's only not that long ago and been done.
Any further questions for Mr Carter or Mr Dempsey this evening, councillors? No. Thank you both for your deputation. All right, that brings us to item 10, which is the draft July reports. I'll now hand you over to the Chief Executive Officer, Mr Mike Bradford, to take you through the balance of the draft reports.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.1, draft payment in lieu of parking plan. This report presents the draft payment in lieu of parking plan for the purposes of advertising.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? Councillor Cridland, I think, was first.
I'm going to ask a rhetorical question as to whether I'm dull, but I don't want anyone to answer that. I did read this, and it seemed to me that we need to put this out for advertising, because if we don't, if we don't make this particular policy, then we can't charge. But we are required, because of state government decisions, to charge far less than the actual cost. Is that right?
Ms Shaw, can I send that your way?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So that is correct. The 15 square metres that's provided in the gazetted version for the calculation represents approximately 50% of the equivalent of what a car parking bay would otherwise need to include. And that does include the bay and adjacent manoeuvring area. It doesn't include that. So that's for the car parking space itself. So a typical car parking space and manoeuvring area would be approximately 30 square metres, and it's at a discounted rate of 15 square metres to that. So it's effectively 50% off that. And then that also doesn't include the aisles and any of the ramps that would otherwise be associated with the construction of a car park. And then just further on that point as well, the AAPC has only gazetted the one version of the calculation, which doesn't include the land value in the calculation itself. And the AAPC has previously advised that they would be looking at investigating gazetting another calculation, which local governments could potentially use. But to date, the calculation itself only includes the 50% portion of what a bay would otherwise cost to construct.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Russell, I saw your hand go up.
Yes, thank you. So I understand that the plan comes into effect when there's more than 2 bays of shortfall. Is that correct?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that is correct, and it only applies to commercial and mixed-use developments, not residential.
Okay, thank you. Could the city explain how the infrastructure catalogue, which I think is section 5.1 and 5.2, work together within the calculation? So is it is it only a selection of one, or is it a selection of many with the parking bay being mandatory? How does one select those?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the explanatory guidelines that are provided in support of the payment in lieu of parking plans list a range of infrastructure that local governments can include in their plans themselves. The requirement within those explanatory guidelines is that each of the items of infrastructure needs to be costed and included in the plan in the interest of being open and transparent. However, the money that is actually collected is only based on the construction bay of a car parking bay itself, which relates to the gazetted formula. So effectively, when we're working out how much money we can collect, we would look at what the shortfall actually is, apply it to the gazetted formula and collect the money on that basis. That money can then be used for the range of infrastructure items that have been drafted in the plan, but it doesn't actually relate to the costing of that infrastructure provided in the plan. So there's no relationship in that respect.
Okay, so you can only charge, was it the construction cost of the bay and not the other infrastructure? Okay, so I guess you may have touched on this then. Who actually decides, or actually, no, actually that's not even a valid question now that you've answered it. So the other thing is that it seems that though the infrastructure cost for the parking bay is not indexed. So how's that afforded? Do we need to keep amending this and therefore the WAPC need to approve this, or can we actually include an indexation in the plan?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We can't include indexing in the plan itself in terms of prescribing it in the plan, because that would be a departure from the model template that the WAPC has approved. However, the explanatory guidelines state that the infrastructure lump sum itself, which would only relate to the car parking bays, would be indexed annually to maintain alignment with the current infrastructure costs. The plans and the regulations don't extend to whether or not the plan then needs to be re-advertised to capture the revised cost estimates in that respect. Our advice on that would be we would update the plan, seek advice from the department as to whether that revised index cost requires re-advertising. And if the advice is no, it doesn't, we would simply update and publish the plan. However, if the cost was so great that it was a significant departure, we could expect that the Commission would expect us to re-advertise. So the intent would be to just simply represent the revised costs when they're reviewed annually to determine whether or not it needs to be represented to Council.
Okay, thanks. Is the plan and therefore a parking in lieu payment mandatory for local government, or is it voluntary?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you. It's not mandatory. However, in the absence of a plan, we won't be able to collect contributions.
Okay.
If
But you could still have parking in lieu, but without a contribution. Is that correct?
Yes, so in terms of the operation of the plan itself, the plan effectively provides the head of power for us to collect contributions. Whether or not the local government issues a notice of apportionment and the associated condition on a development approval that requires payment is a different and separate matter. So for example, we could receive a development application that had, say, a 5-bay shortfall and decide that the circumstances in which the shortfall was provided means it would not be appropriate to seek cash in lieu in that instance, in which case we would just simply not put a condition on the development approval.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions for the administration on this item tonight, councillors? I've got one, and it is to Ms Shaw. One of the common concerns that I hear from our residents is that there's too many cars parking in the streets. So my question is this: will the existence of this plan make it easier for proposed developments to be approved with a shortfall of car parking bays, or is it irrelevant to the question of how many car parking bays are required in a non-residential development approval?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's actually irrelevant, given this is just the head of power to be able to collect contributions itself. In terms of the potential shortfall on site, that would otherwise be set by the car parking ratios that are established either via in the scheme, if it's included by the Minister for Planning when the new scheme is gazetted, or via an appropriate local planning policy that deals with car parking access and design.
All right, so just to make sure that I've understood that correctly, it doesn't provide developers with an argument to say, oh, we can have a parking shortfall and that's okay because we'll be paying compensation to the city. It's really just a mechanism for compensation to the city in the event that a non-residential development is approved with a shortfall of at least 2 car parking bays.
That's correct.
Thank you so much. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.2, proposed 6 by 4-storey grouped dwellings, lot 274, number 31 Leonora Street, Como. To consider an application for development approval for 6 4-storey group dwellings at lot 274 or number 31 Leonora Street, Como. The item is referred to council as the building height exceeds 9 metres and therefore falls outside the delegation of officers. The building height of the proposed development complies with the maximum height prescribed by the Canning Bridge Activity Centre Plan. For the reasons outlined in the report, it is recommended that the application be approved, subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. And councillors, just before I give you the opportunity to ask questions on this item, I do understand there might be a bit of an update on the report on this item. Ms Shaw?
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. The city would just like to foreshadow some potential changes to the conditions that have been included in the report. The first relates to condition number 8, which relates to the tree retention in accordance with the tree survey plan. There are 3 trees on the site that have the potential to be retained, being 2 ficus trees and 1 Kurrajong tree. The report recommends at least one of the ficus trees should be removed and that crown restoration would be required if the Kurrajong tree was to be retained. That tree is actually currently structurally compromised due to the co-dominant stem of the tree, and the city has since received advice and reviewed a recent JDAP decision where it was determined that the retention of invasive root tree species would not be appropriate and that ficus trees in particular should not be used in any deep soil locations. Further, the city has since reviewed the 2 verge trees, which are the 2 small callistemon trees in the front, which have been proposed to be removed and replaced as part of the application. So the city considers it appropriate that conditions number 9 and number 16, which related to the retention and protection of those trees, should actually be deleted to enable the replacement of these trees in accordance with the landscape plan that has been submitted in accordance with the application on the basis of the current health of these trees.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, do we have any questions for the officers on this item this evening? Councillor Russell.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. Has the city assessed the proposal against universal access as highlighted in the activity centre plan?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that was undertaken as part of the assessment and the design review panel also considers that given it's an element contained in volume 2.
Okay, thanks. With regards to the landscape plan, could you please provide a copy that's actually quite readable? I mean, I think it comes in an A3 version and there's no way we're going to read it. Thanks.
Councillors, any further questions for the administration on this item this evening? Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. One of the things I was a little bit perplexed by was the relationship between the trees that were shown in the landscaping plan and the balconies. I couldn't see how the trees could actually grow given that there were 2 sets of balconies above the trees. So I just wondered if you might be able to clarify that, please.
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So planting on structures was proposed as a means of addressing some of the visual privacy requirements. As you can see on page 17, page 17 of the report, there was I believe, 2 metre variance in terms of the visual privacy requirements in the cone of vision. And so to address that, the applicant sought to add planters to the balconies and the balustrades to try and screen some of that. In terms of the survival rate of those trees, we would, as part of the landscaping plan condition, ensure that they maintain it to the city's satisfaction. So.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.3, revocation of various local planning policies. This report proposes the revocation of 9 local planning policies made redundant by recent changes or amendments to the State Planning Policy 7.3 Residential Design Codes, modifications to the local planning framework, and the increased ability of the state and local planning frameworks to guide development outcomes. Revocation of redundant local planning policies will ensure the City of South Perth's local planning framework is contemporary and fit for purpose.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillor D'Souza, a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. This question is with regards to policy P351.14. On page 30 of the agenda, under the reasons for revocation, just with reference to reason 5, it mentions that the policy currently includes provisions around public safety. Just clarifying, I guess, what in effect would be lost with regards to those public safety provisions should this policy be revoked.
Thank you. Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So public safety as it relates to the planning policy itself was more to do with CPTED and designing out crime principles in terms of passive surveillance of streetscapes. And we can include assessment of that as part of any residential design code assessment in any instance, because the codes require anything above 1.2 metres to be visually permeable.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. A follow-up question, Councillor D'Souza?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Ms Shaw. On the same item, with regards to the restrictive covenant, would, I guess, some removal of this policy potentially reduce the guidance around interpretation of the terms of the restrictive covenant?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the restrictive covenant still, it is retained, it's on the title, so on the certificate of title of each of these lots. So in any instance, any prospective developer of the remaining sites would need to contact the developer and have their designs approved by the developer. The head of power for doing that is provided with that covenant and not through the local planning policy itself. In terms of whether we would have appropriate guidance for future development assessment, yes, we would. And the reason being is that in July 2021, the residential design codes were updated to provide a lot more provisions and detailed design guidance that you would otherwise see within this policy. And also the regulations addresses every matter in the policy in any instance if we needed to rely on that for design assessment.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.4, minor modifications to existing local planning policies. This report proposes to modify 4 policies as part of the City's review of its suite of local planning policies. The proposed amendments will assist in coordinating effective assessment and achieving appropriate development outcomes. Updates to these local planning policies will ensure the City's planning framework is relevant and current.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item this evening? Councillor Russell.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm having a little bit of difficulty reconciling a minor modification to something which looks as though it's quite substantial in its modification when I look at the track change version. So what is the definition of minor in terms of policy amendments?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There's no definition contained within the regulations. It's at the discretion of the local government. However, we would consider something a major departure from the existing local planning policy if it otherwise substantially altered the provisions or the assessment criteria used to assess a development application. So, for example, with P301 advertising of planning proposals, because the amendments to that policy reflect changes that have been included in the regulations in any instance or just provided additional information in terms of heritage assessment, it's not so substantial that it would otherwise warrant a different decision-making pathway, and therefore it's being considered a minor amendment.
Any further questions, Councillor Russell?
Yes, thanks. So on that policy P301, so under section 5.1, advertising not required, is there non-advertising for the State Planning Policy 7.3 Volume 1, where the city is deemed to comply under, is the city, that's done under delegation, so you've become the decision makers, where a development application under that same code is not under delegation. So how does it work in terms of non-advertising, or does it need to be advertised? Have I made
Ms. Shaw.
myself clear there?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the R codes themselves actually contain the circumstances in which advertising needs to occur. If an application is wholly deemed to comply, it must be approved and it cannot be advertised. If an application varies at least one of the deemed to comply criteria and requires a design principle assessment, depending on the extent of the variation itself, determines whether or not it needs to be varied, and local governments can determine criteria around that. However, the R codes prescribe the manner and form in which advertising needs to be undertaken, which is for a minimum of 14 days. So, for example, under the R codes, if there was a variation to visual privacy requirements, that would be advertised because it has a significant impact on the amenity of the adjoining landowners. But, for example, if something like the deemed to comply requirements on the size of a storeroom was varied, it's unlikely to be advertised because it has no external impacts on adjacent properties.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So just regarding the design review panel policy, is the intent of this policy to cover the Canning Bridge Activity Centre?
Ms. Shaw.
Thank you. Yes, it is. So there were two policies, I understand,
Yeah.
and we're looking just to roll it into one in terms of the operation.
And so would this policy need to go to the City of Melville for its approval?
Ms. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I might actually defer to our Manager of Strategic Planning. My understanding is that the two policies themselves operated separately, given they're created under separate jurisdictions under the regulations, but
Mr. Giddens.
Yeah, thank you, through the chair. No, it wouldn't need to go because it's a policy issue and it doesn't materially affect the activity centre plan itself.
Okay, thank you. Just another question. So the track change version doesn't include the agenda template or the assessment template. Is that the intention here, not to have those templates in a revised policy?
Ms. Shaw.
thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's correct. And the reason being is that local planning policies are created to provide guidance in discretionary decision making itself. Any associated appendices and the like that could be formed as an information sheet would otherwise typically be provided on the local government's website instead. In some circumstances, it may be appropriate to have detailed design guidance, for examples of diagrams and such as an appendices, but otherwise you would just usually include it on the website, which is the same reason that many former local planning policies used to include sections that had information requirements. And given these are constantly being updated and varied by the regulations and don't assist in discretionary decision making, they've instead been removed from local planning policies and put as information sheets on local government's websites instead.
So what form will the report take when it's included in the, for example, the RAR? What form would the DRP give to the decision makers?
Ms. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. That's actually quite a good example because the DRP forms are prescribed by the West Australian Planning Commission and are included on the department's website as DR4 from memory.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. Thank you. Just out of interest, who performs the design review for applications that go to Special Matters DAP or the SDAU?
Ms. Shaw.
Thank you. It is the Office of the State Government Architect.
Okay, and would they be using the same templates that you referred to earlier?
Ms. Shaw.
Yes, they would.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Any further questions for the administration on this item, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr. Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.1, listing of payments June 2023. This report presents to Council a list of accounts paid under delegated authority between 1 and 30 June for information.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr. Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.2, monthly financial statements, June 2023, interim. The monthly financial statements are provided within attachments A through I, with a high level of analysis contained in the comments of the report.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item this evening? No. And that concludes item 10. So we now move on to item 12, motions of which previous notice has been given. The first is item 12.1. That's a notice of motion from me, Mayor Greg Milner, entitled Engagement with the Wesley South Perth Hockey Club to identify an alternate location within the City of South Perth for co-located hockey facilities. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? Councillor Russell, I think, was first.
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. When viewing the motion, is the city viewing the facilities A to C independently as written or integrated either two, for example, two or three together?
Ms Shaw, should I send that your way?
Yes, please. I came to the same conclusion at first. I thought it was a co-located facility, but we can liaise with the relevant stakeholders on the assumption that there is either one co-located facility with all of the elements in the notice of motion or that they're separate items.
Councillor Choi, I thought I saw your hand go up there.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. Can the City Administration please recall their response to councillors at the workshop held on 24th of May, which workshop record appears to be missing from the June OCM minutes, but for which I recall the Mayor was not present, opting to attend a media jaunt instead, where I and other councillors asked and discussed the very question postulated by the Mayor.
Councillor Choi, that's a bit out of order. I deliberately didn't attend that workshop because I was co-patron at the time of Wasps Hobby Club. Would you like to reformulate that question, please?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just wondering if the City Administration can please recall their response to councillors, as we did discuss alternatives, I believe, at that workshop, and in terms of possible alternative sites for the WASP facility, and I believe that not all elected members were in attendance.
Who should I send that to, Mr Adams or Ms Shaw? Mr Bradford.
I recall that the workshop was in order to formulate the report that was subsequently dealt with at the June OCM, and so the content was really reflected in that.
Further question, Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. So I note the reporting officer's comments on page 20 of the June OCM minutes, repeated at page 48 of tonight's agenda, that the City will continue to engage with the Wesley and South Perth Hockey Club to investigate other potential assistance that could be considered to support the sport of hockey into the future. If the City is already and remains engaged with the WASPs and other relevant stakeholders and is already providing its assistance, is the Mayor's notice of motion not then superfluous and irrelevant?
Who should I direct that to, folks? Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the City's report tonight just responds to the notice of motion, and it's open for Council to consider or not whether it proceeds with the notice of motion recommendation presented next week.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, are there any further questions on this? Oh, Councillor Choi, another question.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I also note the reporting officer's comments to the Mayor's notice of motion on page 48 of tonight's agenda that the City can review potential locations for each element of the proposal, being primarily the grass hockey grounds, the synthetic hockey turf and the clubhouse, and or relocation or consolidation of other sporting and recreation clubs to provide a suitable site. Given this apparent piecemeal approach, which may not satisfy the needs, the current landscape and range of concerns as outlined in the officer's reports for both the June and July council meetings, which I cannot envisage changing a great deal within the timeframe set out in the notice of motion, and the administration's feedback to elected members at the council's workshop, can the City please offer the most likely outcome of this notice of motion if endorsed, as I don't think it's fair to be kicking this can down the road and raising expectations, like with the RAF, if there's little hope of a different and viable outcome for the community.
Councillor Choi, I'm going to allow that one, but council agenda briefings are genuinely for elected members to ask questions of the administration. You're getting dangerously close to verging on debate. With that, who should I direct that question to? Councillor, Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So it really depends on the outcome of the discussions that we actually have with the WASPs. So in the first instance, we'd be asking them whether or not they'd be prepared to support splitting the facilities itself. If that's a no, then we can further investigate whether there's any locations throughout the city that a co-located facility would be accommodated. But as was outlined in the June round of agenda meetings, we would then need to investigate whether or not another club could potentially be relocated to accommodate such a facility.
Any further questions on this item this evening? Councillor Russell.
Yes, thank you. So where the city refers to a drainage reserve as a possible location, where exactly would that be? I don't think there's too many reserves of such a large nature, is there, within the city? Or is this a drainage reserve outside of the city boundaries?
Ms Shaw. Or Mr Bradford. Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do you mind just referring to which section of the report, just for context?
Yeah, okay. Just a sec.
I'm pretty sure it's just referring to public open space.
No, it actually makes reference to drainage reserve.
So the city has a number of drainage sumps that are actually reserved as public open space, and if they were engineered in such a way that they could still serve a drainage function, it's possible that that land could be reclaimed to serve an active recreation function. Whether or not it's of a suitable size to provide a co-located facility is a separate matter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, do we have any further questions on this item this evening? That's a no. Okay. So we're about to move to item 12.2, but I'm just going to seek a little bit of guidance from Ms Fry. I understand that council agenda briefings are not formal meetings of council, but we do have myself and Councillor Warland having declared a financial and proximity interest on this item. What's best practice? Should I give up the chair and leave the room and let the Deputy Mayor take my place, or what's recommended here?
If you've disclosed a financial or proximity interest, it would be best to leave the room.
All right, then I'll do that. I'll give the Deputy Mayor the chair for any, well, I suppose I should ask, are there any questions on this item before? Does anyone have any questions on this item? Well, yes, we do. Okay, great. Deputy Mayor D'Souza, if you'd be willing to take my spot for the moment, and I'll see you all shortly.
Thank you. So yes, the Mayor and Councillor Warland have left the room. We are now up to item 12.2, which is notice of motion, Councillor Stephen Russell, inclusion of the South Perth Esplanade foreshore into the 23-24 budgeted urban forest strategy review. Members, are there any questions of the administration on this item? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Presiding Member. It appears from the reporting officer's commentary on this notice of motion, as outlined at pages 51 to 52 of tonight's agenda, the city is supportive of creating a John Oldham-style bosque along the South Perth Esplanade foreshore. Is that correct? As from the notes I've reviewed following the rescheduled council workshop held on 21st June while I was away on leave, to review the city's urban forest, street tree management and foreshore shade vista plan, I can see no such recommendation to councillors flowing from the city's recent shade and shelter audit, but I could be wrong, so just seeking some clarification.
Thank you, Councillor Choi. Is that to Mr Bradford or Ms Zamprimo?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So I'm not quite sure that I would say that the officers are supportive of it. It would be up to council to decide whether they support the notice of motion. What we're saying is that it is something that we could do in parallel with the urban forest strategy review.
Any further questions? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, through the Chair, Ms Zamprimo. So just in relation to the recent workshop, was there any recommendations flowing from the city's shade and shelter audit or analysis in regards to the South Perth Esplanade foreshore area? Because I couldn't pick up any from the PowerPoint presentation.
Ms Zamprimo.
Thank you. So through the workshop, what we were recommending was to review a number of existing documents to feed into the updated urban forest strategy and effectively put a line under those historical documents and incorporate anything relevant into the revised and updated urban forest strategy, which is probably why the officer comment is perhaps relaxed about including the John Oldham plan in this process. We don't have any specific recommendations through that workshop around the location based, because at a strategy level we wouldn't go into that detail in each location by location. So the strategy would seek to identify the current challenges that we face and potential opportunity areas, but wouldn't seek to have a detailed plan for each location.
Thank you. Is that all, Councillor? Thank you. Members, any further questions of the administration tonight? Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Yes, thank you through the chair. Tonight we heard a deputation from Mrs. Dempsey and Carter. They they indicated that quite a few surveys and quite a bit of consultation has been undertaken previously. Can you give me any indication when the last consultation was undertaken with the community and whether that was actually for the entire community or just for the proximity of the foreshore?
Mr. Bradford.
So I'll fill in what I can. There might be others who are better placed. But the 2018 Urban Forest Strategy, I'm not, when that was prepared, I'm not sure the level of consultation that occurred there. But I think the main consultation that occurred was in regards to the foreshore management plan, which is the 10 nodes of that, and then the detail around the Connect South. They would be the three items where some element of consultation around some elements of trees and shade were considered.
Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you for the response. Thank you for the chair. So just with regard to the previous consultation, it wasn't as extensive as possibly this is going to be, specifically looking at that foreshore. That's the first question. And the next one as well is, with regard to the petition that was raised, they noted 700 respondents. Is there any indication, again, were those respondents all within the locality or were they, wider community in South Perth?
I think we'd have to take both those questions on notice.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Cridland.
It's not entirely clear to me what area this relates to. I certainly know that it relates to that lawn desert that we have because of the presentations we had tonight. But am I right in thinking this relates to the area from the Narrows Bridge all the way down to Coode Street and the boat shed?
Would that be addressed to Councillor Russell? Yes, Ms. Sampremo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So no, it applies to the land parcels from essentially Miller's Pool to the Centre Gardens car park.
All right. I don't know who John Oldham is, but I can see that he had a vision for botanic gardens encircling Perth water from the motion. Is there any reason why it shouldn't include from the Narrows, well, from your perspective, I know it's not your motion, from the city's perspective, why it shouldn't include the area from Narrows all the way down to, is it Elm Street, which is our boundary?
Ms. Sampremo.
There isn't any reason why it couldn't be considered in that context, and probably, if I may, given that this issue has been highlighted, irrespective of where this notice of motion ends up, we will probably review that document anyway. We already had a look at some of the material to respond to the notice of motion. So if we believe that there's anything there of merit to consider within the Urban Forest Strategy review, we would be considering it in the context of the whole review anyway, because the whole approach we're taking is to review existing documents and look at what relevance can be taken out of any of them.
And as someone who was born in the 1960s, I don't think it's that old, but I found it quite interesting referring to there being some sketches and stuff like that. Is there any possibility of us having any sketch work or whatever, any ideas of what this document is before next council meeting so we could just have a look at it before we vote or not? Or is that asking too much given that we might have to go to the State Library to get it?
So Ms. Sampremo.
So we have located a book that does have some of the concepts contained within them. I think just one thing to consider around it is the sketches in isolation are probably not entirely helpful because time has changed since the 1960s, even though it's not that long ago. And we would need to consider the concepts and the intent of those sketches for the current time. And I hope that sort of comment has come through in the officer comment, but we certainly could try and circulate something. But the main themes and concepts that we would take into account is the intent of varied species that we could consider. So kind of move away from some sort of single species to create more of a botanical environment, but that is relevant to what the species that would survive and be appropriate to the context now.
Thank you, Ms Primo. Councillor Cridland, is it? Thank you. Councillors, any further questions on this item before we... Oh, sorry, Councillor Brandis.
Thank you, through the chair. Tonight we actually heard comments with regard to the planting of trees would increase water consumption because it was not only trees but also the existing lawn that would require watering. Would the city have any indication as to how much water that stretch, say from the Scented Gardens through to Miller's Pool, what proportion of that cuts into our water quota consumption as opposed to the entire stretch, which is sort of city facing along the foreshore? And would a significant increase in tree canopy cover result in a significant reduction in our water consumption?
So, Ms Primo.
Thank you. I'd have to take on notice the exact impact that it would have on our water consumption, but as a whole city, it would be fairly negligible. And what you've got to understand is that in the short term, whilst you're establishing tree canopies, you're not going to see the change. It's further down, you know, we're forward planning around our water consumption. So the idea of hydrozoning areas and providing more canopy is that over time you reduce your water consumption. But you're looking at a very small area relative to the city's overall green space that it looks after.
Thank you. Councillors, any further questions on this item? None? In which case we'll move on, and I'll invite someone to call back the Mayor and Councillor Warland for the continuation of the meeting.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor De Souza, and I understand that would have completed item 12. This brings us to item 15, which is ordinarily where we'd close the meeting to the public if anyone has any questions on confidential item 15.1.1. Does anyone have any questions on item 15.1.1? No, okay. In that case, no need to close the meeting. We move on to item 16, which is closure. So before I close this meeting, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation this evening. I declare the meeting closed at... thank you very much. 7:08. Thank you all and good night.